Hey, and welcome to episode 32 of Think Like a Hacker. We've got a jam-packed episode for you today. We've got some of WordFence's own research about a malvertising campaign that is targeting recently disclosed WordPress vulnerabilities, a new iOS update that contains a bunch of security fixes. Equifax is ordered to pay up, and a bunch of really great stories, so get ready for an awesome episode. Hey Kathy, you're back in Phoenix after WordCamp Boston, right?
Yeah, I went to WordCamp Boston this past weekend, had a great time. It was a really great WordCamp, a little on the smaller side than what I expected, but the people that were there were incredibly welcoming and had a great time.
Oh, that's awesome. Did you manage to go to any of the talks?
I did. I went to a few, and looking at the schedule, there were so many of them that I wanted to go to and I wasn't able to because I got stuck in hallway tracks where just talking to so many different people. But it was a great speaker lineup and definitely one of the more well-rounded out schedules that I've seen. So I got to see Frank Corso talk about just like sort of the beginnings of the internet, and Beth Livingston did a great talk on project management. Really enjoyed that. Wanted to see Dave Ryan's talk on WPCLI, but I missed it because I got cornered in a hallway conversation. And Dwayne McDaniel also had a cool talk on Bash that I wanted to see, but his slides are online, so I'm going to go peek at those.
Nice. Wow. Lots of people that I know and haven't seen for a little bit, so hi to all of you. I haven't seen Frank Corso for, must be since Atlanta, I think. But best regards to all of those folks. And you had your own talk. How did that go?
I did. It was a new talk, and it was sort of like the Think Like a Hacker. The Hacker Mindset was the name of the talk, and it was a new one I hadn't done before. But I had an idea and kind of put it together, and they selected it. And it went incredibly well. I had a great time slot, right? It was the second talk of day one, and that was a full crowd. And it was a lot of fun. I had a really interactive audience, so got to joke with a lot of the participants and talk about, deeper security topics. And afterwards, kind of just went into like a 2-hour hallway track talking about security with a lot of people. And it was really cool because I was talking about, thinking like a hacker. And so a lot of people mentioned that they've been watching the podcast. So hi to everyone from Boston who's watching. It's kind of weird because, we're doing this, like in our personal space, right? And then you go to an event like that and it's like, hey, wow, we're watching you.
Right.
So it's kind of fun.
Yeah. Hi, podcast watching people.
They're real.
Really great to get that feedback for Kathy and I. This is a lot of work, and it's not just Kathy and me. We're kind of the face of the podcast, but there's a lot of folks behind the scenes that make it happen, including Max Clavelli, Dan Moen, Matt P, and a bunch of others. So they get a lot of credit for this. But Max actually went with you to Boston, and you guys shot some interviews there, right?
Yeah, we did. Well, I don't think we've talked about it on the podcast yet, but we made a film about the WordPress community, right? And this film, it's been a lot of work. What we did, films at 4 different WordCamps over the fall and early 2019, and 37 interviews in total. So it was a lot of footage to go through.
Yeah.
And it all kind of came together as a pretty amazing story. So now that we're getting ready to launch it in the fall of this year, we're talking to people about what the open source community means to them. So we did a few in WordCamp Europe. So if you want to follow the it's open.film is the website, and you can follow social media, open.film, open.film, and you can see some of those. You might see someone from a WordCamp.
Yeah. So I tell you what, I'll do a little impromptu talk about the film, since as you said, we haven't covered that on the podcast, and you've obviously shared it quite a bit now. So it was I was chatting with Kerry, my co-founder and wife, about this, and it was Nashville WordCamp US last year, where we were with Andrew and Sean and Dan in that little hotel lobby library area. Do you remember that, Kathy?
I do. That was
So
there was an electricity in the air
I
when we
know.
were talking there.
I know. And I was talking with Kerry about this, and I said to her that was one of the happiest moments of my life. It was the weirdest thing. I had a glass of wine in my hand, and it didn't have a whole heck of a lot to do with the wine, but the wine may have had something to do with it. But I was with Sean and Andrew, and other members of the production team, and you were there, and we were kind of really ramping up on the project, and we were doing some filming and some planning and so on. And I think I don't want to give too much away about the film, but a certain someone had agreed to do an interview with us, and we were all on a huge high, and we were sitting there in that little library, and I just realized this is one of the happiest moments of my life. And I think that since then the film itself has really bitten me in a big way. And so the deal is that Sean Corbett and Andrew Rodriguez are filmmakers in Denver, and I know Andrew through family, and they're both really, really cool people, and they're really talented. And we, I guess we pitched them the idea to do this. Kathy, I think you said I came up with the idea, but I honestly don't remember that. So maybe someone else came up with the idea. But we basically connected with them, and we decided to do this film about the WordPress community and the people in the WordPress community. And the more we chatted about it, and the more we kind of thought about the idea and started researching it, the more it just really grabbed hold of us and kind of told us that this is something. It compelled us to make this film. And Andrew and Sean are the filmmakers, and they worked incredibly hard to shoot footage at I think you said it was a total of 4 WordCamps, Kathy?
Yeah.
And one of them was WordCamp US, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then there was the big sort of post-production process started. And Kathy, you supervised the film, basically the project management of the film. Kathy and I are executive producers on the project, and I played a little bit of a hands-on role. I did the color on the film. I got really passionate about color a while ago, and I worked with Sean Corbett, the director. Sean is the director, and Andrew is the producer. And we made a film, and I remember when we started seeing the first few edits, they were pretty bad. And then Sean, the director, locked himself in a room for a weekend or more than that, and what emerged was magic. And
yes.
I'm going to stop talking now because I'm going to give away too much. But our plan is to premiere it around WordCamp US time. We're coordinating schedule and space and other things of that nature. So to be determined, but the website is open.film, and the website was officially launched a few days ago. We had kind of a placeholder website up there, but you can now sign up for the mailing list to get details on the premiere. The film has been entered in 3 film festivals, so we're waiting to hear back about those to see if we're accepted into any of them. And it is an emotional journey. We've shown it to, I think, 4 people outside of the production team that are kind of very close to us, and the reactions have been, let's just say they've been emotional. It's a real journey, and it's a documentary short, so it's not a full feature-length documentary. I think the full runtime is about just over 13 minutes long. And so we will premiere it at an event in fall, and then we're also simultaneously going to release it on the website on open.film. And the film itself is actually open source. It's going to be released under the Creative Commons license, so you can remix it and make all kinds of things out of it of your own. So we're just really excited about that. And this, by the way, was completely impromptu. I do not have this on my little script in front of me that Kathy and I work on right before we do these podcast episodes. So that's a little preview into what's going on there. But visit the site, it's open.film. You can find out more, and by all means, tweet at us or email us or contact us via the site and sign up for the mailing list, because pro tip, that's where we're going to announce things regarding the premiere.
Yeah.
So
and definitely even follow the social media, because as we put out, it's so fun asking people the question of what open source or what open means to them. And every answer is different, but there's a common theme. So they're kind of fun to watch.
Yeah, and so just to expand on that, what Kathy and Max have been doing is they've been going around I was going to say the country, but actually the world, because you guys did this at WordCamp EU a few weeks ago, where they'll basically talk to people in the community, and some of them are actually friends of ours, some of them are in the film and in the documentary, and we'll ask them what does open mean to you, the concept of open, in general, in the context of WordPress, in the context of open source. And some of the answers have been amazing. And I think Adam Warner was one of your the folks that you asked, Kathy, and he was great. I mean, Adam's just a natural. He was like, boom, here's like the 4 things it means to me. And his answer was quite beautiful, actually.
And he did that like completely impromptu.
Yeah.
A lot of people are like, let me think for a minute. And Adam is just on.
I know.
You could always count on Adam to be beautiful for the camera.
Right.
He just,
legend.
Camera loves Adam.
Totally. All right. So yeah, I guess that's WordCamp Boston. So you had a good time over there, huh?
I had a great time and definitely hope to go back next year. It was the 10th anniversary, so they organized a trolley tour of Boston. So we got to go see all of, didn't even have to move, just a bunch of WordCamp people on a couple of trolleys going through all the historic sites in Boston. And that was really cool. It's such a beautiful city, and I had never been before and can't wait to go back. So hoping to go back again next year to WordCamp Boston.
Well, I actually think that was Carrie, my partner's first WordCamp ever, was WordCamp Boston.
Really?
And she said it was really special.
Yeah, it's definitely a great event. It was really fun. I feel like I have to apologize to the people of Boston, because as soon as I arrived, the temperatures went up to like 100. Like
you dragged Phoenix with you.
I did. And as soon as I came home, everything's fine there now. I think their high today was 73 or something gorgeous like that.
Wow.
So sorry, Boston. I didn't mean to ruin your weekend.
Cool. All right, let's dive into the news. So I guess the lead story for us today is the malvertising campaign that is targeting recently disclosed WordPress vulnerabilities. This is some of our own research on the WordFence blog. It's from Mikey Veenstra and the threat intelligence team, which is of course led by Sean Murphy. And the story there is that the team identified a malvertising campaign which is causing victim sites to display unwanted pop-up ads, redirect visitors to malicious destinations. And these destinations include tech support scams, malicious Android APKs, and sketchy pharmaceutical ads. And so the MO there, the modus operandi, is that attackers are injecting a JavaScript payload into the front end of the site using by exploiting these vulnerabilities. So the vulnerabilities in most cases, or in all cases, allow the attackers to inject content into a site, and the content they're putting in is JavaScript. And what that's doing is redirecting the visitors to the site to a central domain that the attacker of course controls, and then that the domain reroutes the visitor based on certain criteria, like what kind of device they're using. So iPhone victims would get redirected to maybe some malicious iPhone campaign, and Android guys will be directed somewhere else. And I guess it's important here to differentiate between the different victims. So the site itself is of course a victim here. Someone owns that website, and the attacker will inject code into that website, and it harms the site, it harms the business behind it, and so on. And then there's another victim, which is of course the visitors to that site, and they are the true target of the attacker. So they're redirected to malicious campaigns of various types. So one plugin that's being targeted here is the Coming Soon Page and Maintenance Mode plugin, and that's made by WP ShopMart. And version 1.7.8 or below are affected. So if you're using, and the name of the plugin is, quote, Coming Soon Page and Maintenance Mode. So if you're using that plugin and you're using 1.7.8 or below, then definitely upgrade. And the latest version is 1.8.2, which presumably has fixes for all of this. And yeah, so this is basically an XSS vulnerability, cross-site scripting vulnerability, where attackers get to put their own code, their own content into a site and get the site to do bad things to the visitors. Other plugins that are being targeted is the Yellow Pencil Visual CSS Style Editor, and that's version 7.2.0 or lower. And that vulnerability there is an unauthenticated arbitrary options update. And then the other plugin that's being targeted is Blog Designer, and that is version 1.8.10 and lower. And also that's an XSS vulnerability there. So for Yellow Pencil, if you're running 7.2.0 or lower, update. If you're running Blog Designer 1.8.10, definitely update. Our team in the blog post have published IOCs, or indicators of compromise, for other researchers who need to protect their customers. The indicators of compromise are basically things that you can use to detect this badness. So in this case, it's domains that the attackers are using, attacking IPs that you can block to prevent this attack, and also malware hashes that you can use to detect the malware on your site. And of course, these are things that we use in our own product to detect and block certain, these attacks. But what we want is for other vendors out there to also incorporate protection into their products. And so we share this data so that our fellow security researchers and our fellow security vendors can protect their customers against this. Both the free and premium version of WordFence are protected because our firewall has robust cross-site scripting protection built in. And so that protection's been in there for probably years at this point. But if you're running WordFence free or premium, you're protected against this, even if you're running one of these vulnerable plugins, although I would not recommend that. So if you are running one of the vulnerable plugins, even if you're running WordFence, I would recommend updating ASAP. And you can find the full blog post on our site, and we will put that in the show notes. So some pretty cool research there, huh, Kathy?
Yeah, hold on a second. I have a cat that's missed me and really wants me to hold him. So a lot of these plugins have been, these older versions have been vulnerable for a while. So if you've been keeping your site up to date and you're using WordFence, you're fine. But we're still seeing a lot of people who aren't keeping plugins updated, and they're the ones that are receiving these types of attacks and redirecting site visitors to bad parts of the internet. So once again, keep everything updated, right?
Yep, exactly. Most important thing you can do. Keep everything updated, other than installing WordFence. Ha ha ha. All right, so moving on. This is just a quick one, and there's an iPhone iOS update that was released today. Today being July the 22nd, and this is iOS version 12.4, and it includes security updates. And this is via Pat Gray, who runs the Risky Business podcast. So subscribe to Pat's podcast if you're a security professional. I'm a huge fan, and we've been sponsors in the past, and I've been interviewed by Pat, which is a lot of fun. So I picked this one up via his Twitter feed, but I'm just going to go through some of the headlines here real quick. So some of the updates are, there's a few core data security improvements that they've made. They're fixing issues where a remote attacker may be able to leak memory, a remote attacker may be able to cause arbitrary code execution. Bad, like really bad. A remote attacker may be able to cause unexpected application termination or arbitrary code execution. Then a FaceTime fix, a remote attacker may be able to cause arbitrary code execution. Also, like you don't want to hear that. That's kind of the worst case scenario. Found in apps, in quotes. Also, a remote attacker may be able to leak memory. In Foundation, a remote attacker may be able to cause unexpected application termination or arbitrary code execution. And there's fixes for Heimdall, libxslt, messages, profiles, Quick Look, Siri, telephony, UI Foundation, wallet, WebKit. Lots of WebKit fixes. Wow, lots of CVEs there as well. So this is a really, really big one. And I'm seeing thanks to folks like Google's Project Zero, Tencent were some of the contributors here. The security researchers who reported vulnerabilities. So if you're running an iPhone and if you're running iOS and you're not running 12.4, update immediately, because this is a big one, and I think you're going to be seeing more of this covered in the news. Presumably Pat will cover it in his podcast and so on. So Kathy, are you an iPhone or Android?
I'm iPhone, so
there you
pretty
go.
much as soon as we're done.
Yeah, okay.
Don't try to call me back, it'll be updating.
Yeah. So this Equifax story, my sense of schadenfreude kicked in a big way when I read this. Pretty funny, huh?
Yeah, it's time. I mean, this was such a simple breach and so touched the lives of so many people, because 147 million people at minimum were exposed in this incident that happened in 2017. So Equifax has now agreed to pay up to $700 million to settle this data breach with the FTC. At least 300 million of this will go towards paying for identity theft services and other related expenses. Now, if you divide up the settlement with the number of people that were breached, it's like $3 a person, but you have to be able to like prove that you were affected by this. So now what happened in early March of 2018, Equifax announced that 2.4 million additional US customers were affected by this breach. They claimed to have discovered evidence of this event on July 29th, 2017. It took them 6 weeks to notify the public after finding out about the breach. Now, Equifax is a credit reporting agency, which means that they have information about consumers who use credit, but you didn't necessarily say to Equifax, yes, you can have this. You probably have an agreement with your credit card company that says, in the fine print that you can, give this that they can share this information with credit reporting agencies. Like Equifax, there's 3 major ones in the United States. So even after this breach was reported, they set up a response website to address questions, and security researchers, of course, took a look at that, and it in itself was riddled with vulnerabilities. So there seems to be a pattern of just some security issues. The original breach was caused because of the Apache Struts web application software that had a vulnerability that was not patched on a web server. So if you can provide evidence that you were affected by the breach, either by being victimized by identity theft or fraud, then you get more than $3. You get up to $20,000 payout. Now, this settlement still needs to be approved by the courts, but if you do think that Equifax was the cause of any kind of identity theft or fraud, now's the time to do the research, but proving that you deserve this payout could be next to impossible. You have to prove that your data was in a data dump specific to the Equifax breach. There will be so many hoops that you have to go through. And I think, honestly, the ones that come out of a class action suit like this or a settlement like this as winners, it ends up being lawyers more than anyone who is actually affected. What
Agreed.
do you think, Mark?
Yeah, totally. The settlements on an individual basis are usually tiny, and most people don't even apply for them. And yet the lawyers kind of accumulate X percentage of it and make a lot of money. But what I think this is a case of is an incumbent, an organization that's been in an industry for a long time. I don't know what the history of Equifax is, but it just feels like they've kind of been resting on their laurels, and the fact that they have a captive market and haven't really taken security seriously, and so they don't have security chops. The story about the website to deal with the breach itself being riddled with vulnerabilities. There's just they don't have a clue. And so I think there's a lot of old organizations out there that have a very steep learning curve to climb. And having said that, I will now contradict myself and say that there are actually some old organizations that really have their act together. I used to work for the BBC, and their operations team kind of knows what they're doing. So yeah, I guess it's a mix, but this just feels a little bit like Equifax has a lot of catching up to do.
Yeah, it definitely seems that way. Well, and it kind of segues into our next story, which, do you obviously probably follow the Have I Been Pwned Twitter account and see the number of alerts that have come out just over the last 10 days, right?
Yeah, well, I haven't looked at it for a while, and you alerted me to this right before we went live here. And it sounds interesting. What's going on there?
Yeah, well, I looked for other news outlets that might be reporting this because it was just something that I noticed. I obviously subscribe to the service so that if my email address ends up in a breach that is reported by Have I Been Pwned, I get an email. So I went and looked and just kind of paged through the Twitter account to see what else was going on. And there were, between like July 13th and today, there were a number of breaches, and most of them were all attributed to as one single security researcher. Now, some of these breaches were recent, and some of them were older. But the one thing that they all had in common was just the extent of users in these breaches that were affected. So on July 13th, an online gaming site, MindJolt, 28 million records. On the 14th, Evite, which we talked about on a previous podcast, but 101 million unique email addresses. On the 15th, Netlog, 49 million. PieZap, 42 million. Fashion retailer Shine, 39 million. Backspigot MC, 8.5 gigabytes of website files and databases, and 140,000 email addresses and usernames. Also passwords in a lot of these. Animoto, 22 million unique emails. YouNow, emails, 18 million. Also names and IP addresses and even social profiles. The Bulgarian National Revenue Agency was in there. Eat Street, 6.4 million. That was the one I was in.
Nice.
Everything from address, date of birth. It's just like art value, 158,000. Roll20, 4 million.
That's a role-playing website, to be clear there. Roll20.
Yeah, Roll20 role-playing website. Armor Games, 10.6 million accounts compromised. Game Salad, 1.5 million. Stronghold Kingdoms, 5.2 million. Flash Revolution, 1.9 million. And Xiaomi User Forum, 7 million. This is millions of people. And interestingly, in a lot of these breach announcements, they're saying, what percentage is already in the Have I Been Pwned database. So they cross-reference to say, well, your email address was in this breach, but, you're like 66% of other people who are also, in the same, already in the database. It just underscores how important, two things are. First of all, to use unique passwords everywhere, because your password, if you had signed up for any of these sites, your password is now in Have I Been Pwned. It's also in the dark web, wherever the security researcher had found this. You can go on the Have I Been Pwned Twitter account, and it gives more details, and obviously on their website as well. Also recommend subscribing to the service so that if you are in a breach, that you receive an email letting you know that, whatever site you've signed up for, that you are affected. And also our favorite thing to ring the bell on, two-factor authentication. Right, Mark?
Yeah.
On everything.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So let's put this list in the show notes. But do you think we've reached peak breach yet, or I think it's just going to keep getting worse?
I think it's going to keep getting worse. It just seemed like there was a rash of them all at once, and I think it may be attributed just to the security researcher, finding all of this or finding a cache of things. But just expect that any password that you've used on any site anywhere has been in a breach, and that just because you've used it, it is now vulnerable, and to just use password managers and unique passwords everywhere.
Yeah, for sure.
And two-factor, of course.
Yeah. So these are all databases of breaches that Troy has added to Have I Been Pwned, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so he did that all within the last week. And so, it's also a case of Troy being busy. Perhaps
Yes.
he's not traveling and he's adding these things. But visit haveibeenpwned.com and put your email address in there and see if you've been involved in these breaches or any other breach. And then I guess Troy is still selling Have I Been Pwned, and I haven't seen an update about that yet. But hopefully when it gets a new owner, it is still as awesome, because it's a really, really valuable service to kind of figure out which of your emails have been breached or have been involved in a breach, and which breaches you've been involved in. So yeah. So there's a story that I noticed that Russian intelligence has been hacked with social media and Tor projects exposed, and this is actually another hat tip to Pat Gray, who tweeted about this. Forbes are reporting that hackers managed to steal 7.5 terabytes of data from a contractor to the Russian FSB. And of course, FSB is the successor to the Russian KGB, and they're the equivalent of FBI in the US or MI5 in the UK. And they're reporting that this exposed a secret FSB project to de-anonymize the Tor browsing service and to scrape social media and to help the Russian state split its internet off from the rest of the world. And to be honest with you, the only reason I included this story is because, for a little bit of a chuckle, because Russia actually asked for help to de-anonymize Tor back in 2014. The Ministry of Internal Affairs in Russia offered a $100,000 reward to anyone who can help them de-anonymize Tor. And so it's not exactly a secret project. And then, of course, scraping social media is something that any sensible intelligence agency in the world should be doing. And if you're not doing it, you're not really an intelligence agency. And then helping the state split off its internet off from the rest of the world, well, it's kind of like a lot of states are doing that. I mean, China's got the Great Firewall of China, and a lot of other states have kind of balkanized their internet a little bit and are trying to do more of that. So really no surprises there, but just for laughs and cackles, we will include that in the show notes, and I'll include the link to the 2014 story on Russia asking for help to crack Tor. And if you're kind of new to cybersecurity, Tor is a browsing service that lets you browse the internet anonymously, but it has historically it's had a lot of security holes, and some very high-profile people have been arrested and thrown in jail for the rest of their natural lives because of security holes in Tor, including Dread Pirate Roberts, among others. So yeah, in other news, a nation got hacked, Kathy.
It looks that way. And this was also on Have I Been Pwned? CNN also reported it on July 21st. And it looks like the country of Bulgaria had their tax service basically hacked. Now, Bulgaria only has 7 million people that live there. Well, I don't know how big Bulgaria is. Only, maybe that's like packed, I don't know. We do have one person, I think, at Defiant who actually lives in Bulgaria, and I hope Ned was not hacked. But records of more than. We should ask him. Yeah. Yes,
I want to message Ned right now.
He would probably know. He would probably know and give us more data. But records more than 5 million Bulgarians were stolen by hackers from the country's tax revenue office. So the majority of Bulgarians were affected. A 20-year-old cybersecurity worker was arrested in connection with this hack. The computer and software used in the attack led the police to the suspect. So, lesson? Do you have a lesson here?
Yeah. No lesson.
No lesson.
don't. Yeah. If you live in Bulgaria, that's a bummer. But I did message Ned as we're chatting here, and if he gets back to me, I'll if it's something that I can share, I will definitely share it. But it's 5 out of a population of 7.1 million. 5 million out of a population of 7.1. So it's basically everyone who is probably of tax-paying age has been affected here. And it's a real bummer. There's kind of nothing you can do to protect yourself here, and there's a lot of anger around it. We're seeing a lot of anger on Twitter and in various articles and blog posts that have been posted and so on. So yeah, that's kind of a bummer. But in other news, there's Kazakhstan is trying to implement something where they're requiring, the government is ordering all ISPs in the country to force customers to install a government-issued root certificate by Quasnet Trust Network on all of their internet accessing devices, whatever that means. And a Kazakh official clarified on July 19th that the installation of the certificate was voluntary and not a prerequisite for accessing the internet. But basically, this is kind of a land grab. So the story here is that what they're trying to do is man-in-the-middle secure browser traffic. And in fact, any security traffic that uses TLS/SSL. And the way it works is that they'll have you install a new root certificate. You will try to, from your browser, establish a connection to a secure site out there on the internet. Because the Kazakh government can control points of egress on the network, points of exit on the network, they can intercept your traffic. And if you haven't installed a root certificate from them, then it's kind of a bummer for them, because even though they can intercept your traffic, they can't decrypt it. Well, what they do in this case, once you've installed this root certificate, is they will intercept your connection. You'll actually be connecting to their server. And as you try to authenticate the server, because you've got their root certificate installed, your browser will say, yeah, this is fine. You can connect to this, even though it's not ebay.com or paypal.com or whatever, gmail.com or whatever the thing is you think you're connecting to. So you'll be connecting to their server, and actually what you're connecting to is a proxy server. And on behalf of you, so they will decrypt your traffic, examine it, they'll know who you're trying to connect to, and then on behalf of you, they will reach out and connect to the real gmail.com or ebay.com or paypal.com, send the request you wanted to send, get the data back, and examine the data to their heart's content, and then re-encrypt that data and send it back to you. And so man in the middle is kind of like a proxy, where the proxy, the person who's running the proxy, who's injected themselves in there, can actually examine your traffic. And clearly the intent here is to remove people's ability to privately browse the internet, and give themselves the ability to examine traffic as people browse the internet. And to quote the cliche, it's basically Orwell's 1984, where you have the state observing, surveilling their citizens, and identifying people who are potential troublemakers in their view, and that's problematic, for a lot of reasons. And I don't want to dive into a philosophical explanation of why I think that's problematic, but I think I've done it in the past on the podcast. But I think that people need private spaces, and to debate, for example, whether the current government should be in power or not. And I'm not talking about the US alone. I'm talking about every country in the world. Without that government having an extraordinary amount of power to monitor those conversations and potentially suppress them so that they can remain in power. That's just an example of one of the problems with removing things like private browsing, and there's a whole host of other issues there, right, Kathy? Yeah.
And it looks from the article that I read on private internet access, which is a VPN service, that the Kazakh government had tried this before in 2016, but backed down. And then that statement that Kazakh official had stated that it's voluntary, maybe they're backing down again. One can only hope. But this is definitely a story to watch.
Yeah, it's just very, very tempting. I've lived in a surveillance society, and I'm laughing because I live in a surveillance society, but I've lived in an old school surveillance society back in apartheid South Africa, and that was used. Obviously, it was much technology was in the 1980s was very different to the technology we have today. But the government back then would persecute people and van them, as Pat Gray likes to say. But they would literally disappear people who were opponents to the government, and the way that they identify those opponents is through surveillance, and as much surveillance as they can get away with. And so I think the interesting thing about the story, is sure, maybe they've backed down, but this is incredibly tempting for a lot of governments all around the world. If you are a government that wants to remain in power and you want to identify opponents, you just salivate over the idea that you can surveil just web traffic. Because if you think about how people use Facebook and Gmail and so on, there's just so much data there. It's so rich. And the data mining tools that are available today and a lot of them are free, open source, freely available for anyone to use around the world for good or bad. The hardest problem for them to solve is to get access to that data. And so if one government manages to do this and manages to successfully man-in-the-middle traffic on a long-term basis, and to be honest, I haven't gone around and done an audit of the current state of this, But the more governments that do it, the more this is going to become okay and the accepted norm until everyone's doing it. So I think pushing back on this is really important.
Yeah.
But that is it for the news. And then, as a last item, I just have a minor sort of thing that I want to mention. It's been kind of interesting, Kathy, you and I running this podcast and going off and doing research into what the news is. And obviously we are a news source ourselves. WordFence publishes research and we originate research and are used as a source by ZDNet and various other publications. But we also go out there and find the news so that we can include it here. For example, I think I mentioned Pat Gray probably 3 times in this podcast. We also, one of our awesome sources is Catalin Kimpanu, who writes for ZDNet. Bleeping Computer is another one. Lawrence writes for them, and so on. And those are all great journalists, and their articles are generally quite data rich. But there's this trend that I'm seeing on the in cybersecurity news, where there's a single fact that what am I trying to say here? So there's a single kind of fact that a cybersecurity journalist will try to build a story around, and it might even be a rumor or a leak, and they'll mention the single fact in the first paragraph of the news story, and then the rest of the story is just a history lesson, combined with the message that the risks continue to increase in the particular space that they're reporting about. And I've literally seen major news networks and major newspapers do this, where they will spin a 2,000-word story on just a single fact, and it's really difficult to substantiate that fact. And in some cases, it's impossible because it's a leak or an anonymous source or a rumor, and then the rest of it is just history lesson, and things are getting worse. And it really comes home to you when you're doing research for a podcast like this, because you actually read an article trying to distill the facts from it, and you realize that there's actually almost no new data. There's no new fact. There's just history lesson, and things are scary, and the one thing in that first paragraph, and then you go out and you try to substantiate it, and it's really difficult. And so the reason I'm mentioning this is because the folks who listen to this podcast and who watch it on YouTube, I think it's really important to read cybersecurity journalism with a little bit of a critical eye or a critical ear if you're listening to it, and kind of look at it and say, well, where is the new data here? And how much of this is just here's the history lesson, and here's how things are getting worse and are getting way more scary. And you might be surprised at some of the major newspapers in particular in the Northeast, no names mentioned, that will do this. They'll have a single fact and then just build a massive story around it, and there's just really nothing there. So that's my my little monologue for the end of this podcast. Kathy, you have anything to add to that?
Cybersecurity it's important. It's critically important for people to be aware of what's happening. Just like it's important for people to understand, the security of their neighborhood. And it's so tempting, I think, for journalists to go towards sensationalism, or taking one minor thing and sensationalizing it and building this giant thing around it. But it's more of, the media has a service as kind of like the fourth estate, right? To be of service to the population that reads that news. And so I would just appeal to that ethic of being of service to the people who are, rely on journalists to report the news. And, those who do will rise to the top. It becomes increasingly and sometimes painfully obvious who the great reporters are, and those who are just, turning in their 2,000 words for the day.
Yeah, agreed, and well put. All right, lest we are accused of doing the same thing, we'd better wrap it up. So if you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please give us a review. It really helps us get the podcast out there. And thank you to everyone at WordCamp Boston who gave Kathy and Max kind feedback and agreed to do an interview with them. We'll be airing some of those interviews in the near future. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye.